Addiction is the focus. And we all know what that is. I want to talk about severe addiction. Of course, there are all levels of severity, but I want to just start with the image of a severely drug or alcohol addicted person. And I would just kind of see that person. And, you know, we all know in one way or another somebody who fits that description. We're talking about a person who is socially irresponsible, is not helping at all really in society. We're talking about a person who is almost entirely preoccupied with himself or with herself. We're talking about a person who is hurting themselves. And we're talking probably about a person who's in some kind of denial, doesn't even appear to know what harm they're doing to themselves, and a person who is in some degree dangerous. And this for anybody is a mystery, right? Why is this person like that? Especially if this is a person that we have known and loved for years when they weren't like that, and now they're like that. Why? The greatest tragedy of our field intellectually is that we really don't have a coherent answer to that question. Why are people in that condition? The brunt of my talk here is about answering that question of why. Because I think that all of our policy is inevitably confused unless we have an answer to that question. We tend to kind of evade that question and say, well, there's a little of this and a little of that, and we have a bunch of theories and they're all good, but I don't think that's good enough. I think we are trapped in our bewilderment, and it makes it very difficult for us to reach any kind of solid conclusions. So I'm going to propose to you that there is a coherent answer to that question of why, and that we have to find it. And I'm going to propose to you what I think to be the coherent answer to that question. This, I hope, will help in the deliberations one way or another. We can start off with this proposition, which is that the view of addiction promulgated by the mainstream media and the official rhetoric has proven inadequate for the 21st century. That is to say, there is an official view. Now, here I may be being a little parochial. There is, for sure, an official view in North America. And is it the official view in Scotland? Well, we'll see. The official view in North America is that drug addiction, or any kind of addiction, is an individual problem. We have a person who is addicted. We like to say it's a progressive relapsing disease, meaning that they're not really going to get over it permanently, although they may learn to control it better. And we like to say that it can only be controlled by some kind of professional intervention. They have to have a professional. In my world, that view is promulgated everywhere. Our politicians say it, our media say it or imply it, our schools teach it to the children. It is the official view. Of course, not everybody believes it, but it is the official view. It has a kind of unassailable official quality. I'll show you a picture of what I think the official view is. There it is. I put it in terms of heroin addiction there, but let me just put it in terms of drug addiction in general. Here it is. We have a person, and the person uses this drug, and the consequence is we have an addicted person over here. There's a causal thing which happens. Somehow the drug transforms the person. And once the person becomes the addicted person, then the person has all these problems. They're anxious and they're depressed and they're likely to be violent, they're likely to be criminal, and they're really not contributing economically to society or in any other way. And they have certain addiction-specific consequences. That is, for example, if it's a heroin addiction, they have withdrawal symptoms. The essence of this as an idea is that the causal agent here is the drug. The person takes the drug, the person is transformed, we have an addicted person. Now, there's variations on this idea, all kinds of variations. We can, in the old form of the idea, if you go back to the 1840s, go back to Women's Christian Temperance Union in my part of the world in 19th century, and what we say is if a little girl takes a single drop of alcohol, she's doomed to become an alcoholic, and all this is going to happen to her. And the drug, a single drop transforms her. That's really the old form of the idea, although that idea recurs. That was the same idea about crack cocaine in the 1980s, just a single dose, instant addiction. That's the old form of the idea. The new form of the idea is we say, well, the person, it depends. The person has some genetic qualities and some environmental things, and so some people are more vulnerable than others, and by being more vulnerable, we mean that the transformation occurs sooner. So if the person takes the drug, well, some will be transformed right away. Others can take it for a year, and then they'll be transformed. But it's going to catch up with them. The people who don't believe that for sure in my part of the world are the people who do the work. That is the drug addiction counselors, the social workers, the community workers. They say, well, no, it's more complicated than that. You've got to deal with these people's lives, or you can't worry about the drugs all that much. It's much more complex than that. I don't want to belabor this idea because it's not important. I think this is an outmoded idea. I think this idea does us a lot of harm because it confuses us. As a lecturer at the university, I know I can't get halfway through my lecture before someone's going to raise their hand and say, but wait a minute, you're forgetting that dopamine, as soon as the person takes the drug, the dopamine goes squirting out into the nucleus accumbens, and then they become addicted, and why are you forgetting that? But I'm not forgetting it. I would maintain that this idea is truly an obsolete idea, and we need to get rid of it. I'm not saying, by the way, that it's not useful in some kinds of therapy. It has certain heuristic value in 12-step groups and so forth. There's nothing wrong with it if you choose to use it as a therapeutic tool. But as a policy group, we have to question this thing quite severely, and everything is wrong with it. One thing which is wrong with it is that it lays itself out as a doctrine which is derived from science, and in recent times we say, well, it's derived from neurochemistry, and we can show the evidence on brain scans that it's true, but it's not derived from that, nor is its origin scientific at all. Its origin is Christian. Its origin, you can find it laid out in an abstract way in St. Augustine, in the Confessions. Slightly abstract way. That takes a little explaining, but I won't undertake that at the moment. But for sure, you can find it laid out in a perfectly explicit way in the Christian temperance movements of the 19th century. The idea is, this drug is the demon drug. That was a word in the temperance movements. The demon drug possesses people just like demons possessed people in the Middle Ages. The demon drug possesses people, transforms them, and if you associate with demons, you get what you deserve, which is to be transformed is to be possessed. And then you have all these horrible qualities. Well, there are, of course, certain kinds of scientific evidence, it's good science. I mean, there's certain kinds of scientific evidence can be brought forward to support this idea, but that is not where it comes from. It comes from, it's a particular part of our Western heritage. Second thing that's wrong with this idea is that people can use these supposedly addictive drugs for years, for very long periods of time without becoming addicted. In fact, they can use them for their whole lifetime. Some of the best recent work on this is done at Glasgow Caledonian University by Phil Delgarno and others there. Tremendously important work, but they weren't the first people to do it. It's been demonstrated over and over again. People can use these drugs for a lifetime and not become addicted. And they can use plenty of them. The Guardian newspaper in the last 2 weeks, has rediscovered a study of cocaine use, a worldwide study of cocaine use. I suspect most of you have seen that article by Ben Goldacre in the Guardian. He says, well, the WHO did a study 14 years ago showing that people can use cocaine for very long periods of time and not get addicted to it, and it was repressed. This is what the Guardian says, and it's true. It was suppressed by the American government, who threatened to take away all the funding of the WHO if they published this article. So it was not published. Well, there's tons of evidence. This equation is not true. That's a problem. The WHO cocaine study was done in 22 sites around the world. I was the principal investigator in the Vancouver site. So, if it should be useful for you guys or any of your organizations to have some of the unpublished data from the WHO study, I can provide it for you, and I'd be happy to do it. Another thing that's wrong with this is that this is a disease process. It implies there is a medical solution, but really there's no medical solution. I mean, of course, medical intervention and psychological intervention helps. There's nothing wrong with it. It can help in many cases, but it's not. It can't make this go away. It can't bring this under control. And in fact, The greater number of people who recover from addictions do it without medical intervention or psychological intervention. They just recover naturally. Another thing is, with this, is that this makes addiction out to be a drug problem, but of course it isn't. It's possible to believe that there is a drug that you've never taken and that I've never taken and that would transform us into an addict because we never took it. And again, fully documented that there are addictions every bit as serious and threatening, including life-threatening, as drug addictions, to things like gambling and sex and food and things which we all know are not addictive. They don't cause addiction for most of us. We know that, right? So unless you somehow say those things aren't addictions, but you've got no basis to say they're not addictions except by fiat. We say, well, we'll restrict addictions to drugs. They're not different psychologically. So again, this thing falls apart. The biggest problem with this thing is that this really has been the basis of our official approach to addiction for 100 years. And it's not solving the problem. The problem is getting worse. I saw some awful, scary statistics yesterday about Scotland. They're getting plenty worse in Scotland, and it's getting worse in lots of places as well. Scotland happens to be in a jump right now, but so is China. So are many other places. The mainstream view is defective, and it is defended. Imagine that the United States government suppressed a report of the World Health Organization for 14 years, and it's not out yet. I mean, that's a lot of defense. Imagine that a study came out, a book came out this year by a Harvard University professor, and all the media in my part of the world expressed outrage that this guy said that the official view of addiction was wrong. It was as if no one had ever said it before. I don't know if that story has been over here. I would say that the official view of addiction has all the defense and all the fortification and all the power of the mathematical models which proved beyond doubt that securitized mortgages would not fail up until about a year ago. It has that kind of status. It has official support and all kinds of really, really fancy science to bolster the official pronouncements that support it. That doesn't make it true, I think. In fact, I think we have to get rid of it. So here's my second proposition. Contrary to the official view, the source of today's flood of addiction lies in the dislocation of entire populations of people from their communities and cultures in the globalizing postmodern world. Can you put that together? The alternative, which I say will replace the official view, not too long from now, the alternative comes not, of course, from the top down, but from the bottom up. And this is part of my subtitle, Going Up the Down Ladder. We got to go up the ladder because in this case, the real wisdom is coming from the bottom up. It's coming from the workers in the field who are out there saying, well, look it. These people are addicted because, dare I say, they've got shit for a life. That's why they're addicted. And they're grasping onto something which it's not great, but it's one great big jump better than having nothing. That's what they're saying. And it's not just field workers who are saying that. It's not just clinical people who are saying that. It's also academics. Unfortunately, it's the academics at the bottom of the hierarchy, too. It's the historians and the social scientists, the ones who are losing all their funding. I just came from a wonderful conference in Glasgow, which was a conference of historians of alcohol and drugs. Great conference. In which, and I would say virtually nobody in that conference believed the official view of addiction, and they would all, I may be overstating this, but at least most would tend to lean towards this kind of a view. So what is this kind of a view? This kind of a view differs dramatically. I mean, it's not as simple as turning it around up on its head. It differs dramatically. It's a paradigm shift from the official view. What this says is that if we want to understand addiction, we have to understand it on a population level, It doesn't mean, in the end, of course, we have to understand it on an individual level, but we start on a population level. And we have to say that look, whole societies go galloping into big addiction problems. Whole societies. And this is built on the concept of dislocation. Dislocation is just a piece of jargon, but you'll know what I mean. Dislocation refers to the fact that people have to have a life. And to have a life is something social. It means people have to be part of a community, of a family, of a value system, of perhaps a set of spiritual beliefs. People have to belong. This is crucial in psychology, and this is, I think, what Margaret was talking about, right at the start of this. If people don't belong, if people don't have a place in the world, then they're really hurting, and they're not just hurting in the sense that they're likely to become addicted. They're hurting in the sense that they're really not going to be they're not going to be contributing to the economy. They're much too preoccupied with their problems. They're looking for their identity. They don't have a life. They've got no time for the economy, and they're going to be depressed. They're going to be anxious. They're going to be violent. Of course, there's a very high likelihood of suicide. They're going to there's a high likelihood of child abuse. When people are in that state, they don't like themselves, they don't have an identity, and they're worthless and dangerous. And of course, people get into that state in many ways. Let's say a person is rejected by their society just because there's something amiss with them. Their society just can't tolerate them. They become dislocated, and they go into that kind of a state. Or let's say that an empire collapses. Like the Roman Empire collapsed, and what happens? You see this kind of chaos in the people. It shows up in the individual psychology of the people. The only period that I've been able to find where I think addiction and these other problems was probably as common as it is now was the Roman Empire of St. Augustine. Again, I go back to St. Augustine because the empire was in collapse. Everything possible was going wrong, and they believed correctly that the world was coming to an end. It was coming to an end. I mean, the imperial world was coming to an end, and the people were like this. And St. Augustine thought, well, you can't really take any drug or do anything that's pleasurable because you're going to get addicted to it. Because dislocated people really don't have a life. And what do you do when you don't have a life? Well, you act like this, all these problems, but you've got to do something about it. You can commit suicide. You can just go into, you can give up completely and go into a kind of catatonic or psychotic state, or you can become addicted. And addiction has to be understood this way. Addiction functions. And if you work with addicts, you know this. Addiction functions. It's a way. It is a life. It's not the greatest life. It's not the life you thought you were going to have. But it is a life. And so that in my part of the world, we have a so-called downtown East Side, and all the junkies are down there. And it's a great discovery of recent years that those junkies are not just down there, chasing heroin and shooting up and selling their bodies on the streets. That's not what they're doing. They do that, but what they're also doing, they have a society, and it's quite a real and active society, and it matters to them, and of course they're in danger from their neighbors, but they also have their close friends, and they have their close associates, and that society really works. Addiction is always provides a substitute for a life that has some validity to it. Dislocation leads to addiction because addiction is a way of adapting to dislocation. Dislocation is unbearable. This is why, for example, solitary confinement or ostracism, or excommunication. These are all horrible punishments which are done to people. These are punishments which inflict dislocation on people. They're horrible punishments because we're not built to bear that. We are social animals. We don't work that way. We have to be social animals, and to be dislocated is to be suffering badly and to be vulnerable for addiction, because addiction is a partial compensation. It's a partial life.